Blue Origin's New Glenn rocket finally flies and achieves orbit, SpaceX's Starship rocket flies for a 7th time, acing another booster catch but losing the ship, India achieves a key milestone in orbit, and Stoke Space just got a hefty amount of money to develop its ambitious Nova rocket. As always, we'll cover all that and even more epic news this week in Spaceflight. This was quite a week for big news and also for big rockets. After many years of design, development, and testing, Blue Origin debuted its New Glenn rocket. Liftoff took place on January 16th at 7:03 UTC from Launch Complex 36 at the Cape Canaveral Space Force Station in Florida. The rocket crawled its way off the pad with all 7 BE-4 engines on the booster burning bright and blue. The rocket continued its ascent over the Atlantic Ocean, successfully achieving main engine cutoff, stage separation, and ignition of the 2 BE-3U engines on its upper stage. The 2 engines burned for about 10 minutes, the first of 2 burns scheduled for the mission, and successfully placed the upper stage and its payload into a preliminary parking orbit. This marked the first time that Blue Origin launched anything into orbit, and also the first launch for New Glenn as well. The payload flying on this first mission was a Pathfinder version of Blue Origin's own Blue Ring platform. Blue Ring is one of the many projects that Blue's working on, and it's meant to have multiple purposes, from an in-orbit tug to a satellite bus with its own propulsion systems, avionics, power systems, and much more. This rocket in particular was flying just the core avionics and guidance systems of the future product, allowing Blue Origin to test those in orbit before actually putting Blue Ring into full production. The BE-3Us then reignited about 57 minutes into flight to insert the Blue Ring Pathfinder into a medium Earth orbit. This marked the end of the job for New Glenn and also marked its first successful flight. The booster, however, was not as successful after stage separation. Blue Origin's New Glenn rocket is meant to be partially reusable, with the booster landing downrange on a drone ship. For this mission, the booster, named So You're Telling Me There's a Chance, was supposed to land on Blue Origin's Jacqueline barge, but unfortunately, it didn't happen. After stage separation, New Glenn is meant to perform an entry burn and then a landing burn, but it seems like the entry burn didn't go so well as it didn't slow the booster down as expected, and telemetry was lost shortly thereafter. Blue then confirmed that the booster had been lost. But it's worth a reminder that the main goal of the mission was just getting the rocket into orbit. A successful booster landing was really just the icing on the cake for the mission, as it was likely to be lost on the first try anyway, and that's exactly what happened. But they gave it a try because there was always a chance that it could succeed, and that's where the booster got its name, So You're Telling Me There's a Chance. You might notice that's also a movie reference. This booster loss, though, does seem to have triggered a mishap investigation, at least according to the FAA, which is pretty much what happened to SpaceX and Falcon 9 in August when booster B-1062 was lost during its landing. Blue has another booster and second stage currently being finalized, and CEO Dave Limp says that they're aiming for a second flight of New Glenn in the spring. As usual, we'll keep an eye on the lead up to the second flight thanks to our Space Coast live cameras and the Cape flyovers. So don't forget to like and subscribe, and also follow along if you want to stay up to date on all of that and a whole lot more, like the next story about the other big launch of the week. This week, we also had the 7th flight of SpaceX's Starship rocket, and this one kind of went the opposite way of what happened to New Glenn. The booster landed, stunningly, I might add, but the upper stage was lost. But there's a whole lot to unpack here, so we'll begin at the start with the liftoff of Booster 14 and Ship 33 from Starbase on January 16th at 22:37 UTC. The booster once again seemed to perform well, with all 33 engines lit up and working all the way to hot staging. Hot staging also went well, with all 6 Raptor engines on Ship 33 lighting up, and the booster flipping back and starting its boost back burn. This boost back burn started with 12 engines instead of all 13 inner engines, which at first kind of made us wonder if the booster was doomed, but that couldn't be further from what actually happened. Demonstrating Super Heavy's engine out capability, the booster continued its boost back burn, and launch control gave the go for catch. After coming in hot through the atmosphere, the booster lit up all 13 inner engines, yes, even the one that went out on the boost back burn, and started its landing burn. With the 13 engines up and running, Booster 14 down-selected to the 3 innermost engines and gracefully landed down on the chopsticks at the launch tower. Once again, a Super Heavy booster has been caught by Mechazilla. The cheers and joy didn't last long, though. While the booster was returning to the launch site, Ship 33 continued its way through space, firing its engines, but then one of them turned off. at least according to the on-screen telemetry. One of the onboard cameras showed a fire coming out of one of the hinges on an aft flap, and then more engines kept going out. Just seconds later, the telemetry stopped, and let's be honest, it didn't look like great news. After a few minutes of controllers looking at all of the data, SpaceX confirmed they had indeed lost Ship 33 before completing its ascent burn. Ship 33 was a new version of the ship, which often goes by different names like Block 2 and Version 2. This version was almost a complete redesign of the ship, from tanks to propellant systems, avionics, and many other systems being completely redesigned from what they were on the previous ships. A demise of Ship 33 was certainly a lot more likely than on previous vehicles, but that loss was definitely a bummer, as this ship was lost during ascent rather than on other segments of the flight, like during the coast phase or during re-entry, which would have, frankly, been more understandable. This loss was reminiscent of the loss of Ship 25 during Starship's second flight, which was also lost during its ascent burn and broke up at around the same time in the mission. Just a few hours after the breakup, Elon went on X to give an update on the flight, saying, quote, "Preliminary indication is that we had an oxygen/fuel leak in the cavity above the ship engine firewall that was large enough to build pressure in excess of the vent capacity. This type of failure seems reminiscent of Ship 25, which was also lost due to a fire in its engine section." Elon continued, saying that, quote, "Apart from obviously double-checking for leaks, we will add fire suppression to that volume and probably increase vent area. Nothing so far suggests pushing the next launch past next month." So SpaceX may have a path to quickly solve this issue, but there might be something even more important that they're going to have to take care of first. As a result of Ship 33's breakup, the FAA had to issue a debris response area in the zone near Turks and Caicos where the Starship debris landed after breakup. The FAA confirmed to NSF that, quote, "A debris response area is activated only if the space vehicle experiences an anomaly with debris falling outside of the identified closed aircraft hazard areas. It allows the FAA to direct aircraft to exit the area and prevent others from entering." So yeah, that's not good for SpaceX. Having debris falling outside of the predetermined areas is one of the many conditions for the FAA to request a mishap investigation from a launch company. And now to Ryan for some late-breaking news.
Believe it or not, things move quickly in the spaceflight world, and just as I was editing this video, the FAA released a statement saying, quote, "The FAA is requiring SpaceX to perform a mishap investigation into the loss of the Starship vehicle during launch operations on January 16th. There are no reports of public injury, and the FAA is working with SpaceX and appropriate authorities to confirm reports of public property damage on Turks and Caicos." SpaceX had given an update on its website overnight confirming what Elon had said about a fire in the engine section of Ship 33. The update also stated that the ship's debris, quote, "would have fallen into the designated hazard area." And perhaps the use of wood in that statement was carefully chosen, as they're probably still assessing the debris situation.
As usual, this is a developing story, so as always, the best way to keep track of it is by staying tuned to our channel and our social media sites. On Monday, we're going to have a weekly Starbase update episode where we'll go over all of the latest from this flight, including all of the post-recovery operations for Booster 14, and what's up with future vehicles as well. The Indian Space Research Organisation, or ISRO, has successfully docked 2 spacecraft in orbit. In the final days of 2024, ISRO launched 2 spacecraft for the space docking experiment, or SpaDeX for short, to specifically test a newly developed docking mechanism. Last week, we reported that the experiment had been postponed after the satellites drifted more than ISRO expected, but this week they tried again. Before the experiment, the 2 spacecraft were stationed 1.5 kilometers apart, but over a period of a few days, they slowly moved closer together, passing through various checkpoints. ISRO first performed a trial in which the spacecraft approached each other up to 3 meters and then moved back to a safe distance. A few days later, after analyzing the data from this run, ISRO commanded the spacecraft to move past the 3-meter hold point and go for it. India's docking system is very similar to NASA's International Docking System standard, so from this point, the procedure is actually very familiar to anyone who has watched Dragon or Starliner dock to the International Space Station. First, the 2 spacecraft connect in a so-called soft capture. Then the mechanism retracts, followed by the spacecraft locking together in hard capture. And it was a great success! ISRO later reported that it was able to successfully control the 2 joined spacecraft as a single object. Next up will be a power transfer test and undocking. With this achievement, India is now the fourth country to develop this technology after the US, Russia, and China. But they're not just doing it for the achievement. The country actually needs these capabilities for its Gaganyaan human spaceflight program, for which they're developing a human-rated spacecraft and eventually a space station. The docking mechanism is also needed for the Chandrayaan-4 lunar sample return mission. This will be a challenging mission with multiple launches and spacecraft that all need to dock in orbit. To perform all of these missions, India needs a lot of launch capacity, and another launch pad would be very useful for that. So, on the heels of the successful docking, the Indian government approved the budget for the construction of a new launch pad at the Satish Dhawan Space Center. It's named the third launch pad, even though it's actually the fifth, because in addition to the first and the second, there's also a much older decommissioned launch pad and a commercial pad that saw its first suborbital launch last year. So the third launch pad will also be the third active launch pad available to ISRO. Naming confusion aside, the new pad should be completed in 4 years. It'll be designed so it can be adapted to support ISRO's Launch Vehicle Mark III and next-generation launch vehicle rockets. And now we'll take a glimpse at some other stories across space, starting with Arianespace, which is getting ready for the first commercial flight of its Ariane 6 rocket. You may remember Ariane 6's first flight last July, which was mostly successful as it delivered its payloads to orbit. However, when it was time to demonstrate the rocket's new capability to relight its upper stage, nothing happened, leaving 2 customer re-entry capsules stranded in orbit. However, Ariane 6's first customer payloads don't need this relight capability, so the first flight did prove the rocket was ready to fly those missions. This week, Arianespace stacked the rocket for its first customer mission on the launch pad in Kourou in French Guiana. First, the rocket's center core with the upper stage attached was rolled out to the pad and raised vertical. After that, the 2 solid boosters were attached to the sides of the rocket. Now Ariane is getting ready to integrate the payload, the French CSO-3 reconnaissance satellite, which also happened to arrive in Kourou this week. With that done, the rocket should be ready for launch, currently scheduled no earlier than February 25th. Hopefully, this will be the first of many successful Ariane 6 launches. VAST has entered the next phase of development for its Haven 1 space station. This week, the station's primary structure qualification article left the factory for its test campaign. This test unit is nowhere near a completed space station, but it has all of the parts needed for testing. Before it left the factory floors, engineers installed the space station's hatch, the large domed observation window, and tank mass simulators. The structure was lifted onto the test stand at VAST test site in Mojave, where it'll undergo a series of tests to replicate flight conditions while engineers measure how the structure strains and deflects. If the measurements are within the expected range, they'll verify that the space station can withstand the forces of launch, and once in orbit, the pressure differences between the station's inside and the vacuum of space. VAST wants to launch Haven 1 as soon as possible, maybe even this year. In fact, the company's already started working on the flight article that'll be sent into space. With this small single-module space station, VAST hopes to pique NASA's interest as it wants their support for the much larger Haven 2 station, which the company wants to be the commercial successor to the International Space Station. The European Space Agency is working on a plan to reduce space debris, and this week it released a to-do list. Space debris is a big problem in spaceflight, as even a tiny piece can do a lot of damage if it impacts a satellite at orbital velocity. Because of this, ESA wants to get to zero debris by 2030, and to do that, it spearheaded the Zero Debris Charter a few years ago. The charter has since been signed by well over 100 organizations in 18 countries. Representatives of the parties that signed this charter worked on a new to-do list. It outlines 6 major goals that not only cover how to prevent space debris in the first place, but also how to reduce and mitigate the risks and effects of it. This includes potential collisions, as well as the effects of space debris on the atmosphere and astronomical observations. Unfortunately, none of the points on the to-do list are binding, so the signatories of the Space Debris Charter aren't actually obliged to work on all of these tasks at all. But let's hope that many of them will start working on them anyway. Rocket Factory Augsburg has permission to fly its rocket from the Saxavord spaceport in Scotland. This week, the UK Civil Aviation Authority granted RFA its spaceflight operator license, also known as a launch license. The license has no time limit and allows for a wide range of trajectories and orbits. The company now has all of the regulatory approval that it needs to launch this year, but does it have a rocket? You might remember that RFA ran into a bit of an issue last year. In August, the company performed a static fire test with the RFA-1 first stage that was meant for the first flight, but something went wrong and the explosion that followed destroyed the rocket. We haven't seen any new first stage hardware since. Nevertheless, clearing the paperwork is a major milestone to get to that all-important first flight. With the launch license now ready to go, RFA is shifting its focus to the technical preparations for the first flight. So maybe RFA will be shipping a brand new rocket to Saxavord soon. We'd sure love to see it. We also got some amazing news from Stoke Space this week. The company announced that it completed another very successful round of fundraising, raising an impressive $260 million, more than doubling its total funding to $480 million. Stoke has been working on a fully reusable medium-lift rocket called Nova at a blistering pace. The company performed hop tests with an upper stage test article in late 2023, and last year we saw Stoke fire its brand new first stage engine a number of times. The engine, called Zenith, is powered by methane and runs the full-flow staged combustion cycle, which is notoriously complex. Nevertheless, Stoke seemed to speedrun the development process of this engine. With the new funding, Stoke wants to accelerate even more, so get ready to hear much more from this company. This week, we unfortunately had to say our goodbyes to the European Space Agency's venerable Gaia mission. The spacecraft launched on a mission to map the Milky Way just over 11 years ago, and on January 15th, it observed its final star. Throughout its mission, Gaia observed billions of stars to create the largest and most precise map of our cosmic neighborhood. These observations have uncovered many mysteries of the Milky Way's past, and thanks to Gaia, astronomers have a better understanding of our home galaxy than ever before. Gaia delivered way more than it was originally tasked to do. Its mission was originally supposed to last just 5.5 years, but it ended up lasting more than 10. What's more, Gaia also precisely determined the orbits of over 150,000 asteroids in our solar system and saw galaxies and quasars far beyond the Milky Way. It even discovered an entirely new type of black hole. But there may still be more to come for Gaia. Next year, ESA plans to release a massive data set to the scientific community. This will be a true feast for astronomers and may even be hiding many more surprises. Over the next few months, ESA engineers will perform a few technology tests to see how the spacecraft hardware held up after over a decade in space. After that, Gaia will use its last drops of propellant to move away from its current orbit at Lagrange Point 2 into a heliocentric orbit far from the Earth's sphere of influence. There, ESA plans to pacify the spacecraft on March 27th, and that will truly mark the end for Gaia. Now let's take a look at the space traffic of the week and see what's coming up next week in spaceflight. Starting off the week, we had the launch of a Zhelong 3 out of China. Liftoff took place on January 13th at 3 o'clock UTC from the Dongfang-Hong Tiangong barge off the coast of Haiyang. The rocket was carrying 10 Centispace 1 satellites into low Earth orbit. These satellites are Global Navigation Satellite System Augmentation Signal satellites from Chinese company Future Navigation. This batch of satellites is the second being launched to support this constellation, which is planned to include up to 160 satellites. And speaking of satellite constellations, the next launch we had was none other than a Starlink launch from SpaceX. The mission started on January 13th at 1647 UTC from Space Launch Complex 40, and it was carrying 8 Starlink V2 Mini and 13 Starlink direct-to-cell satellites to low Earth orbit. The first stage supporting this mission, B-1080, was flying for the 15th time, and it successfully landed on SpaceX's drone ship, a Shortfall of Gravitas. Just about a day after that, we had another Falcon 9 launch, but this time as part of SpaceX's Transporter 12 mission. Liftoff took place on January 14th at 1909 from Space Launch Complex 4 East at Vandenberg. Falcon 9 was carrying 131 different payloads into sun-synchronous orbit. Transporter 12 is the company's latest launch as part of its small-sat rideshare program, the 14th overall and the 12th of the Transporter-type missions. These small-sat rideshare missions are regular launches that carry multiple small payloads all bundled together in the same Falcon 9 for a lower price than a dedicated ride to orbit. In the case of the Transporter missions, they go into sun-synchronous orbit as compared to the bandwagon missions, which are also part of this program, but go to mid-inclination low Earth orbits. This particular mission carried 131 payloads to orbit, and of course, if we went through every single payload, we'd need an hour-long episode. But don't fret, because you can check out a full rundown of these payloads at NSF's news site, courtesy of our writer, Danny Lentz. For this mission, SpaceX used a very young booster, B-1088. This was only its second flight, and it made an epic return to launch site landing at Landing Zone 4, just a few hundred meters away from the launch mount. We also had another Falcon 9 launch a few hours later, but this one was moonbound. The mission started on January 15th at 6:11 UTC from Launch Complex 39A at NASA's Kennedy Space Center in Florida. The Falcon 9 was carrying 2 lunar landers on their way to the moon. The 2 lunar landers in question were Firefly's first Blue Ghost lander and iSpace's second Hakuto R lander. Firefly's Blue Ghost was flying as part of NASA's Commercial Lunar Payload Services contract, flying a number of payloads for the agency to the moon, as well as some other commercial ones. This is the 3rd mission overall for that program after Astrobotic's Peregrine lander and Intuitive Machines' Nova C lander, which both flew last year. Falcon deployed Blue Ghost into orbit, where it will spend 25 days. Firefly later confirmed that the lander was doing well and that it had completed on-orbit commissioning. On March 2nd, Blue Ghost will complete its journey to the moon and attempt to land on the lunar surface near Mons La Trielle in the Mare Crisium volcanic basin. If all goes well, the lander is set to operate its 10 science payloads on the moon for 1 lunar day. After Falcon 9 released Blue Ghost, it fired its upper stage engine once more to reach the deployment trajectory for Hakuto R. This trajectory takes the lander to the moon in about 4 to 5 months, where it's set to land near the center of Mare Frigoris. This will be iSpace's second attempt to land on the lunar surface after a software issue caused the first Hakuto R mission to crash into the moon in 2023. The lander for the second attempt carries a tiny rover, 3 science experiments, a commemorative plate, and an art piece. Of course, we'll cover both landings in more detail in a future episode. We wish Firefly and iSpace the best of luck with their landing attempts. Now, all that said, we already know for sure that one thing from this mission landed successfully, and that was, of course, Falcon 9's booster B-1085, which flew for its 5th time and touched down on the deck of drone ship Just Read the Instructions. We also had a spacewalk on the ISS this week. This extravehicular activity, or EVA, was performed by NASA astronauts Nick Hague and Sunny Williams. Yes, one of the Starliner astronauts. The duo stepped outside of the station on January 16th for a spacewalk that lasted exactly 6 hours, starting at 13:01 Universal Time. The astronauts performed several tasks during the EVA, including conducting repairs on the NICER X-ray telescope. NICER is short for Neutron Star Interior Composition Explorer. The telescope's thermal shields had been damaged, letting light into places where it isn't supposed to be. Nick Hague patched the holes so that the telescope can resume daytime operations. Meanwhile, Sunny replaced a reflector on the international docking adapter that her ride home, Crew Dragon Freedom, is currently attached to. The astronauts also did some preparations for future maintenance on the Alpha Magnetic Spectrometer experiment and replaced a rate gyro assembly, which the station uses to determine its orientation. Closing out the week, a Changzheng 2D launched from China on January 17th. This launch was conducted from the Zhochuan Satellite Launch Center. As is common for Chinese launches, no details about the payload were released before the flight, so we don't know much about it at the moment. Going into next week, we'll have a Starlink launch on January 18th. Lifting off from California, Falcon 9 will deliver 27 Starlink V2 mini satellites into low Earth orbit. T0 is set during a 4-hour window starting at 15:57 Universal Time. Another Starlink launch is scheduled for January 21st. This will be the first launch of Starlink Group 13. This mission will be conducted from Launch Complex 39A in Florida, and the 4-hour launch window opens at 5:13 UTC. Back in California, we'll have the 3rd Starlink launch of the week on January 22nd. Liftoff is expected during a 4-hour window opening at 14:38 UTC. There will be another spacewalk next week on January 23rd, starting at 13:15 Universal Time, and this EVA will be conducted by NASA astronauts Butch Wilmore and Sunny Williams. NASA's really putting the Starliner astronauts to work while they're up there. They'll remove a radio antenna from the station's truss, prepare a spare part for the Canadarm in case it ever needs a joint replaced, and collect some samples from the station's exterior to test whether any microorganisms have decided to call it home. And wrapping up the week on January 24th, we'll have, you guessed it, another Starlink launch from Florida. The 4-hour window for this launch opens at 22:45 Universal Time. And that's your weekly update of spaceflight news. I'm Elysia Segal for NSF, and we'll see you all again next week to recap this week in spaceflight.